Hello everyone, and welcome to our next shared learning event for Align 16. My name is Mark, and I'm joined today by Andy, Nick, and Callum in the chat room. Before we go on to introduce our next guest speaker, I'm just going to go over to Andy for those all-important messages. Thank you, Andy.
So for those of you who joined us before, we'll be following the same protocol really. If we could ask when people are speaking, if we could have the cameras on, and when not speaking, if we could mute, just to get rid of some of the background noise. Liz is going to give a presentation shortly. If we could ask for really welcome comments and questions in the chat box, and then if we save questions, verbal questions to the end, where we'll take a Q&A session at the end. But really welcome any comments or questions in the chat box along the way. That's it from me. Mark, back to you.
Thanks, Andy. One of our ambitions for Align 16 at the beginning is that we were going to help and support our partners in publishing. And we're delighted to welcome Liz Deutsch, who's one of our clinical associates, who's going to share her thoughts with us today on writing, publishing and editing. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks very much, Mark. Apologies to those who've joined us today because I can't see me and my camera won't come on. But perhaps you don't get to see my scruffy hairdo and the grey roots. Perhaps there's an advantage in that. So I'm hoping through today's session, a short session, to give tips and tricks really learnt from the many years of publishing. The first thing I want to talk about, I'll go through 5 parts here. I want to talk a little bit about writing. Obviously, it's not to teach people to write. I want to talk about taking a manuscript you might have, something you've written, something you've maybe had squirreled away for a little while, how to get that mobilized to an article. And then really to talk through 3 very clear processes with tips and tricks about the publication process, the publication team at the journal, and the editing and submission process. Because I think there's one thing that I learned many years ago is never, ever, ever send a dissertation off and hope, because those are the days when you posted things to the editor, and hope that someone will publish it for you, because they will give you an instant rejection. So some of the tips and tricks I'll talk about today are really so that you can get through that process quite smoothly. Okay, next slide, please, and the next slide. So I just want to give a personal story alongside this slide. Apart from having sent off a manuscript, one of the things I always got into trouble for when I was doing my PhD was not knowing what I wanted to write. I could almost see the end points, but I couldn't see the beginning. So the tip really for this slide is that know what it is that you want to write. So somebody might say you're writing an article. Well, you might actually have a whole book in your article. You might have a series, and it might be that that piece of work you thought you got is more than one piece of work. Is it an opinion piece? Have you got nothing but your opinions and those of the others? Have you got any data in it? And some of this might sound really obvious, but the reason why I hone in on it to begin with is that a journal will do exactly the same. So a journal will say to you, we need to know which section you want your article in. Okay, so do you want your article in the audit section, the service improvement, or is it a research study? And the reason is each section of the journal has a very different word count, and usually they start from anywhere from 3,000. And before anyone asks me, the answer is no, you don't get more than 3,000, because in today's clever technology, when you upload your work to the submission of the journal, the process itself, it counts your words, and it will just kick it back and say, you're 1 word over. And you'll scream and shout, and you'll have to do it all over again and take that 1 word out, whatever word you choose. So knowing which section of the journal it needs to go in by knowing what your work is. There's never such a thing as, well, I don't quite know what I've written, whether it's a service improvement or audit. In the title of what you send in, normally you have to say what it is. Next slide, please. So why on earth do you want to write? Why are those people on the call today even thinking they want to write? Because the phrase goes, with all there is to do in life and time in such limited supply, why would you want to spend a minute writing? Well, that's because everyone's got time to write, and the saying goes, there's a book in all of us. So there is time to write, and the first message of this slide is you've got to make time to write. So when do I write? I have 115 publications and 3 books, and I'm a full-time nurse. I write when everyone else is watching the telly. I write when people go to bed. because I will write better late at night. So not only knowing why you want to write, but committing the time to writing. It's the number one barrier that people give to not being able to write. Maybe I start to carry on talking while the technical issues are looked at. So I've got my next slide, which says things that will help you to write. Again, this isn't telling you how to write. This is advice for people who are just starting to write or may have something they've written that needs to be adjusted. So having someone, I call it a critical friend, but having someone that you would share this work with is really hugely important. I know not many places will have this, but a writing group, it sounds ideal. I'm not a member of a writing group, but I have friends that are. I think we're all fairly deadline driven nowadays, so I'm suggesting maybe deadlines work too. And planning it into the week, the next 2 weeks, the next 3 weeks. And believe it or not, the journals themselves will give you deadlines. So if you tell a journal that you're writing for them by contacting the editor, and that's another tip, contact the editor and let them know by email what you're thinking of writing. They'll normally say, well, we're not going to schedule anything for the next 3 months, or by the way, peer review takes 6 to 8 weeks. And they'll give you an idea of how to schedule your work in with the work of the journal. So it's not the stuff of dreams, it's the stuff that fits with a very tight journal publishing timeline and space. And often, especially at the moment with COVID, there's a real goal to fit what you write with what's currently going on in the world. And that is hugely important. So old news, no one wants to publish old news. So it needs to be up to date and it needs to be in with current thinking. Just going to stop for a second. Lovely. You've got them back again. Fantastic. Next slide, please. Fantastic. So top tip number 1, never write without you know who you're writing for. Do not put a word down on paper unless you've chosen your journal. And the reason is because each journal accepts a different number of words, has different sections, has different expectations, different referencing systems. And a bit like the slide shows, lots of lips are all the same, lots of faces are all the very same and similar, but the journal guidelines are hugely different. So you're going to say, well, how on earth do I choose a journal? Are you telling me to choose it? How do I choose it? Well, what do you read? Where do you look for work that you want to reference? What's the article for? Is it an academic article? Is it a professional article? Because there are professional journals, such as in nursing, and forgive me for choosing these, but I am a nurse, things like the British Journal of Nursing, Nursing Times, and the Royal College of Nursing journals, of which there are 5, are all professional journals. They're not academic and they don't purport to be. So they look for the workforce that wants to read them, which is the professionals. Academic journals would be the Journal of Advanced Nursing, and that's because people use it when they're actually going to write something academic. So there's a real difference between the types of journals. And it may be that you've got a journal on the coffee table that everybody reads at work. Read the author guidelines. Have a good look at what they accept and what they don't accept. But choosing your journal first means you know how many words you're writing and whether that journal will even be interested in what you're going to write. Next slide, please. People say, oh, I only write for things that have got a high impact factor. I only ever write for something with a massive impact factor. What does impact factor mean? It means that if they say it's a high impact, don't worry about scores, but it means it's relevant to very many readers, has a rigorous process of peer review, often 3 peer reviewers plus your editor. And if I go to the other end of the scale, low impact is likely to be relevant to a lot less people. And when I say poor quality, you don't get poor quality stuff published, but when I would say that it doesn't go through quite as much peer review and it's a bit more middle of the road. But a high impact is about the number of times it's likely to be cited. And that's what the journals want. They live and die by being cited. So it's no good having your buzz out of being published. That's not about that. You'll get over that very quickly. It lasts 5 minutes and you're happy. Your buzz comes from the number of times that your work is cited by others. And I love it when work of mine, this is very sad, folks, but a 2004 piece of work is still being cited. Why is that? It was in a high impact place. It's still relevant today. It stood the test of time. And actually very few people have published in the particular area I published in 2004. So you can go through this journey. You can say, I want a high impact journal and nothing less. And I have a student at the moment who's now on her 5th revision, a student nurse who's just about to qualify, and she's on her 5th revision of a piece of work because she went for a very high impact journal. And she had to, because it was relevant to that area. So it's a longer journey. Dare I say, it's a little bit more difficult. It's not impossible because lots of people do it. But if you go for Nature or the Lancet, you're going to be there for a while. And on average, they chuck articles out around about 80% of what's sent to them. Okay, so it doesn't mean yours is going to be chucked out, but it means that if you go for high impact, generally a lot more of them don't make the cut. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So the next tip. You've chosen your journal and you're now going to start writing stuff. Well, the little lady there that's knitting, I call writing knitting. You do a few rows and you put it down. You do a few more rows and you put it down. And eventually, you know, if you're a knitter, you'd have some kind of a garment that you're knitting. It's the same with a piece of work. Never, ever wait till you think you've got enough time. You'll never have enough time. Do chunks at a time. If you're co-authoring, which you may well be with others who've got part to say in this, make sure you agree the chunks that they're going to write. And it sounds rather autocratic, but give them instructions as to how long they've got and what you would like to see them write. Never give them a free rein, because they could go off, misinterpret what you say and write exactly the same as you've said, because they've been part of the same project. So an example is, if you've got some statistics and you've got someone who's very good at that and the numbers, get them to do your graphs, get them to do your data analysis, get them to have a real role in that. If you've got someone that's good at qualitative analysis and your article's got some of that in it, you've got to get them doing that. If you're the organizer, you're very good at giving deadlines out, you're very good at managing people, then you might be one of those people, but you still may not be the lead writer. And we'll come back to lead writers in a moment. But my tip on this slide is, just start writing, do a few rows, put it down, have a rest, have a think, go back to it. You do not write an article in 1 day, 2 days or 3 days. You don't do that. Next slide, please. So the detail of the writing process is here roughly. The pre-writing is choosing the topic, ordering your ideas. Drafting is getting them down and being prepared to throw words away. I think in a few slides time we've got something called the word bin. People hate throwing away their words. They want to keep what they've written. They're very attached to it and they try readjusting it. Sometimes it's a complete redraft. And anyone with a dissertation out there or a thesis out there often needs to understand they've got to fully rewrite it to get it journal fit, journal proof, journal ready. Consult with other peer readers. Please don't think that editors correct your errors. They don't. Any errors belong to you and they can sometimes go all the way to publication. It's rare nowadays, but you should always have someone who's prepared to proofread. Now, one thing I find is people go, oh, I don't want anyone else to read it. It's mine. If you're going to get published and you're going to be in the game of getting your work published, be prepared to share what you've written. Share it with a friend, because they're never your friend when they read your work. They turn into your greatest critic. But share it, get it out there, get it looked at, because that's what you're going to do when you get it in a journal, but you're going to be sharing it much more widely than that. So get your critical views before you send it off. Next slide, please. Thank you. Third tip, when you're writing, get those author guidelines. They'll be within the journal, a hard copy itself, or more often than not nowadays, you'll have the own author guideline web page. Download it. And as you can see in the right of this slide here, it's got here, it'll tell you if it's an original article, how many words they want in the abstract and they don't budge, how many words they want in the body, how many references, there's no limit. But do look down here. One of them's got 5 references, and that's all to do with something called copy space. If they don't have copy space in the journal, you can give them 55 references, they will can them. Don't give them the opportunity to can them. You choose which 5 references you're going to have. And it sounds mad because we've always been taught reference, reference, reference. This is all about how much publishing space they've got for your article. The American way of doing things is not to tell you how many words, it's to tell you how many pages you can have. So a journal that I write for quite frequently in America will accept 15 pages, double lined, 12 font. So it is very specific, and it almost feels painful because it is. But if you prepare your work to the exact author guidelines, it's far more likely to get through the first review than something that's been prepared without following the author guidelines. It's all to do with money and publishing space. Next slide, please. Now then, my top tip next. Imagine you started to write, you've roughed it out, you've chosen your journal, you're getting those knitted rows down, few at a time, any time that suits you. But you haven't chosen your title. So I've got a couple of titles here just to jump straight to the third bullet point, peeking in their pots. Perhaps have a little think about what that might be about before I tell you. Acronym SPEED, selecting patients for an efficient and effective discharge. That's one of my own. Peeking in the pots isn't. And you can use the whole conglomerate such as SPEED. People often use a word that represents the title because you can publish the same thing. So I've got SPEED 1, SPEED 2 and SPEED 3, which are all parts of the same study. And it means then I'm more likely to get referenced, cross-referenced, and my work is more likely to be found. So titles are all about trying to find your work and imagine it being cited. So the title is hugely important. You should have something called MESH terms in it, which stands for medical subject headings. The E doesn't stand for anything, MESH. And there is a whole website, and I'll show you briefly on the next slide in a moment, the MESH terms. MESH terms are terms that are understood internationally around the world. And if you use them in your title, so for me, if I put the word discharge in my title, I write a lot about discharge, it's not a good idea. It has to be prefixed with the word patient, patient discharge, and that is a MESH term. And you look in the directory of MESH terms, and if it's not in there, it doesn't exist, and you might have to adjust your own terms in your title to fit with the terms that are within the MESH dictionary. And it's all to make your work locatable internationally. So peeking in their pots. Does anyone on the line want to guess what that might be about? Go on. Have a go. Nobody. So peeking in their pots was a study done by a friend of mine looking into the cooking pots of ladies in a third world country who were feeding their children, trying to understand what their children was fed. And she called it peeking in their pots. I said, it's really great, but you're not writing a novel. You're writing an intellectual piece, an academic piece, and it needs to say, this is a randomized controlled trial, child health, ... Ghana. So in other words, it needs to be a title that locates the person, the work people to your work. It's not clever to have something that looks romantic because it'll mean your work can't be found. Next slide, please. So in summary, the writing process, be clear what you're writing, get an author's copy, download the guidelines, decide what your topic is, try to plan the manuscript sections, plan the content of the sections, and decide titles, keywords, and abstract. And as you go along, review your work. The big thing in the middle, don't forget which referencing system you're using. The journal will always tell you which referencing system they want, and if you don't use it, they will reject your article. And obviously, we all know about Harvard and we all know about Vancouver. There are other referencing styles, and the reason is that some of them want the brevity. They don't want to put lots and lots of dots and commas and hyphens in your work, and they will cut them all out, and the style of that does it alone. Okay, next slide. So part 2, taking it from that manuscript that you're writing, that you're loving, that you're knitting to an article. Next slide. So the next tip really is, you know your sections of the journal, but just to be clear that a non-specialist article goes in a non-specialist section, and in the writing of it needs much more basic language, non-technical, broad and thorough background, descriptive, okay, and don't really need visual references. Okay, so the next one, specialist journal, has a higher starting bar. They assume some basic knowledge of the readers is present, because otherwise why would you have a specialist journal? They expect that the background is less general and more focused on your topic, and they would expect you to have visual references, and they would expect models and theories. Next slide, please. And the next tip, of course, there's something called reporting guidelines. So here you are sitting here with your journal plan, your article plan, sorry, your title at this stage. You've got a good idea of what you think you want to put in it based on the work you're doing. But now you've got something else to contend with, and it's called reporting guidelines. These are the standards of the publishing industry. So if you look at the middle list, all those links work. I'm not going to open them now. But if you're writing a case report, there's something called the CARE guidelines. If you're writing an RCT, there's consort guidelines. If you're doing a systematic review, each of those will guide you as to the kind of content you should be putting in and any diagrams you should be putting in. And when you submit your article online, having followed the author guidelines of the journal, you also have to follow any national reporting guidelines. So there's something called Squire. I can't see at a glance if it's there, but Squire is used an awful lot for quality improvement. Yes, it is there. And if you try to write for the BMJ Safety and Quality without using the Squire guidelines, they will ask you for them, and it's a checklist, and you check your work off against it. So in summary, you've got three things on the go. You've got the author guidelines for the journal. You've got the reporting guidelines that you should be following to make sure you've included the right things, and you've got your own article plan. Next slide, please. The word bin. I've mentioned it briefly, I'll mention it again. Never, ever be afraid to throw words away. And the reason is, if you don't do it, the editors will. What editors look for is succinct writing, short sentences, packing a punch. There's no golden rules about avoiding semicolons or hyphens or anything like that. But if you have too many conjoined sentences with and in it, too many ands, and it's generally above about 15 words in a sentence, they'll write back to you and ask you to put some words in the bin, to cut some words out. So using one word instead of 3 or 4 words, and it becomes a habit. And people say, oh, you do use big words, Liz. And I say, it's because you write with big words. And if you don't, they get canned. And sometimes editors can do a very bad haircut. And if they do, you never forget that article that you sent in that wasn't trimmed very nicely. So my top tip is, when you think you've written your work and you go, oh, it's over words, trim your own words, look at your sentence length and look at the kind of words you've used within the sentence. Next slide, please. And this was the medical subject heading slide. It's not quite in the place I thought it was in. This is a lovely piece of work, which I'm very happy to share. It's an open access article, which means I'm allowed to share it. And it's how to use the subject headings index. Basically, you type in your keywords and your key phrases, and you see if they come up on the medical subject headings. So I write about criteria-led discharge, and I looked up criteria. And to have a criteria means to select. And actually, the word I used in my title was patient selection. I didn't use the word criteria because it doesn't exist in the subject in the subject index. And if it doesn't exist in the subject index, it means my work may not be found and my work may not be cited. Next slide. So the next part, you've now got your work to a point, your manuscript on the left, it meets the scopes, aims and objectives, you've used the correct format, you've followed the referencing, your co-authors are happy. Might seem a very minor point, but I've had co-authors who completely disagree. You're not going to get that work published if they completely disagree, because it gets sent back to all of you. So the peer reviews will be sent back. So you've got to get any squabbles over at this point in time. And then get it proof checked or proofread by yourself. At this stage, you'll submit it through an online process. You'll submit it often in separate parts. The abstract might go first, and then you submit the main body, and then you submit the references and maybe the abstract or diagrams afterwards. And then the very clever bit of kit will build a PDF, and then it will send it back to you for a quick check. At that stage, you can say goodbye to it from anything up to 3 months. During that stage, it'll have anything up to 3 peer reviews. You can get complete disagreement from peer reviews. You can get 1 accept, 1 reject, and 1 be in the middle. So you have to work your way methodically through what they've said. And if the editor sent it back to you, it's usually a good sign that you can do something with it. You will then be asked to revise and resubmit. And then it will go through, can be, I dread to say, another peer review before it's accepted. And the longest it's ever taken me to get a piece published in a high quality journal has been just over a year. Next slide, please. So the final drafting process, I'm going to say something obvious. You're all senior people on the line, do forgive me, but keep all versions of all your drafts. It has many times rescued me from losing a piece of work. And version control, love it or hate it, is critical. Version 1 and the date. And if you're sending your version to a colleague to alter, keep adding your initials on as they've altered it. So version 1, LLD, sent to Mark, okay, ME. And then he sends it back to me. I also keep the original, which is called a master copy. Never, ever delete versions, not till it's been accepted in the journal, because there just might be something you need to dig out, or there might be some disagreement, and it's going to save you hours of work, hours and hours of work. Next slide, please. Messy things about authorship. I said I'd come back to this. This has actually happened to me. I mean, who's an author? Are you an author because you said, can you put my name on it? Absolutely not. There's no such thing as popping someone's name on to give them a publication nowadays. There was years ago. What we do now is we say, what was your role? And it usually allows you to have a drop-down menu. So I pop my name in, Leslie's Deutsch. I'll say, is it your idea? Are you the lead writer? Are you a co-author? And you have to choose one. You can't choose more than one. And then underneath, there's a free text box of what role did you take? Now, the reason for this is because when the MMR vaccine articles came out and all the fuss that happened with those and the data that was in them, they asked the authors to own up to who had written which particular sections of the article. And it happens a lot now. People will email you and they might ask you about your figures, your diagrams. Hopefully they won't be asking you too much because you've been through a very rigorous peer review process. But the person who's responsible for those has to respond. And if you just had your name added because you needed a publication, you can't respond to any of it. So it's actually about the clinical governance. Well, it's not clinical governance, but the governance of the journal itself, and for them being able to respond in a timely manner to queries. So the role of authors and contributors will be asked for as you upload your article. Next slide, please. Your article will be immediately rejected if it doesn't meet the aims and the scope of the journal, which is why it was hugely important for you to choose the right journal and look at what's published within it. If they find you've not followed an ethical process, or you've not given ethical permissions and you should, or you're making excuses and you've done a piece of research and you're trying to masquerade it as audit, happens all the time. I peer review for several journals and I'm editor on 2. Happens all the time. People say, I don't need ethical permission for this. Well, if we say you do, you do, and we'll question it and we'll talk to you. We don't do it all by email. If they think it's of poor quality or badly written, or if they have a feeling something similar has been published elsewhere. And this goes right back to square one of, did you do some kind of a literature review? Did you look where your work fits in the current climate of evidence that's out there? So if you set up a Burger King next to a McDonald's, how do people choose where to come? So if you're sending something in that is very close to something that's already out there, do they want that product off you? And if it's over the word count, they really won't want it from you. So I get through all of this process. My other top tip is I ring the editor, or at least email the editor of the journal very early on, say, hi, I'm Liz. I'm writing a piece of work on pain control. They write back and say, we're bored stiff of pain control. Unless it's cracking the atom, we don't want it. We don't want any more of the same. It's their journal. Don't be offended. It happens, but you don't want to be rejected. You want to get beautifully through the writing and the publication process, and you want them to want your work. So collaborate with them. Next tip, next slide, please. So the fourth part of this presentation today is to give you a brief canter through the publisher, the editor, the reviewer, and the author's role. And this is the team that you've made yourself part of by writing your work. Next slide, please. So the editor-in-chief says what goes. It's their journal. They will reject things, as I've just said. They might even write back to you and say, we like this, but we only want 800 words off you, because if you want 4,000 in, really sorry, we can't put it in till next Christmas. If you'll give us 800 and give us a summary, we'll do it. The editor makes all the decisions about what goes in their journal. The associate editor works with the editor to make sure that they are either commissioning or accepting the right sort of materials that will sell their journal. And the specialist editors have their own sections of the journal that they look after. So one might look after audit, one might look after case studies, one might look after quality improvement, or they might look after particular parts of the body if it's a specialist journal such as the heart journal. And the copy editor does what it says on the packet. The copy editor, once they've been through all these processes and the peer review, with the peer reviewers, the copy editor said, okay, I'm now going to get this ready for copy. I'm going to send you AQs, author's questions. The most author's questions I've ever had on one article was 76. It is exhausting, but they ask you the questions for a good reason, and they want to know the answers. You can't skip them. You're obliged to provide a table with the questions in, and on the right-hand side of the table, the answers to the questions. They often make the changes to the copy itself, but they want clarification on particular points of view. I always say to my good friends, don't get arsey, you know, don't get defensive. Understand that they're asking you for very good reason. And then last but by no means least, you're the author. You're actually now playing a game with all of these people, and that's the game that you play when you publish. Next slide, please. So the last and final section of my presentation today is you've got through all of this process, you've got to do the online submission, and you've now got to get through the editing. So be crystal clear about the authors. I think I've said enough on that. Journals never allow any flexibility. If you're going on holiday, do tell them you're going on holiday, because if they contact you and you're not available, they will just put your article on one side because they've got no reply from you. Do as the online system asks you to do. It seems weird sometimes that they ask you to upload your article back to front. It also seems weird that they don't allow you to upload your diagrams quite often within the manuscript, even though they're going to be published within the manuscript. They want them separately. That's because they go to a colour editor, and they don't like colours like green and blue, because if people are colourblind, as I am very colourblind to green and blue, they don't want to put charts in where data could be misrepresented. So each person has their role, and the online system plays to those strengths. I would advise you that once you've submitted it online, to keep a note of the date you submitted it in a diary, and then a note of 6 or 8 weeks' time, just in case you need to recheck on the online system and see where it is. It's all done electronically. They will email you, but things can go wrong. Sadly, I once had a peer reviewer die, not because of my work, I might add. They had a horrible disease and they died, and all their work that had been sent to them was stuck in their inbox. And I wondered where my work had gone. I was panicking about it. And in the end, they had to go through some very fancy process to retrieve all of the work and resend it out to other peer reviewers. So it's just a little jog. If you've got, I've often got 5 or 6 pieces of work on the go, and I can never remember where things are in the process. Next slide, please. So copy editors, commissioning editors, specialist editors, what do? Read and interpret. The first edit, they suggest revisions, ask questions. If it gets a second edit, they're really trying to polish it up, and they might be asking you very pedantic things, and you think, oh, don't know they know that, they're an editor. I've often screamed at my computer and thought, please tell me they know that. They're asking you again because they don't know that. Proofreading, maybe a couple more times, and any final queries, and then they give you a deadline and a date when it's going to go in, and then it's happy hour at the bar. Next slide, please. Any resubmission requests. If they ask you to resubmit something in a different format, Do it very carefully. Sometimes at this stage, I find it necessary to speak to a friend or someone that's working with me because they can help me. So I've just had to ring a friend up only the other day in London. She's a very, very highly accomplished writer. And I said, what on earth do they mean by this? I've never come across this before. Oh, she said, this is nasty. She said, they want you to go back through all of your papers and give them a quality score. I said, I've almost got to start all over again. But if that's what they want you to do and add things in, it means they want you work. So be reassured by that. They wouldn't get you to do it if they didn't. It means that it will add to the quality of the article. Next slide, please. So I think I may have got to the end of my presentation for today. I've tried to distill my knowledge from all the years that I've published and all the pain that I've gone through. But it really is a matter of, as my PhD thesis supervisor said, she said, Liz, you're not James Joyce. You need full stops, you need commas, you need to take breath. You need other people to want to read your novel, and you need them for you to get it in the right order. I've no regrets about publishing. It's been a fantastic blast over all the years that I've done it. You get better at it the more that you do it. And I'm always happy, there's only a few of you on the line today, to play critical friend to any of you that may want to be thinking of going through this process. So thank you very much for the airtime today. I now look forward to handing over to Nick, who's going to run the Mentimeter session.
Thanks, Liz. I find it really interesting. I've never, one of those things where, I've said to people before, I've always fancied writing. It's one of those things that I never really got round to. But I think you may have just give me a little nudge in the right direction. So thank you for that. So everybody, as usual, we run a short Mentimeter session just to get your feedback or ask a few questions. Liz has posed a few questions for you as a group, and wouldn't mind getting your thoughts. So as usual, we're using Mentimeter. So for those who are on the call, if you could just grab your phones and hold the camera up to the QR code, and that should launch Mentimeter. Yeah, that's great. So we've got a few little click on the hearts there. If you're not using your phone, if you want to use your laptop or PC, you can go to mentimeter.com and use the code at the top of the screen. Someone's feeling Batman today, so that's fantastic. We're all like feeling a bit Batman today. So the first question that Liz wanted to ask was, have you published any work previously? It's a simple one, yes, no, or it may be in progress at the moment. So currently, no. Oh yes, we've got a couple of people. Yeah, good, excellent. So half and half. Nobody's currently in progress. Brilliant. So we've got some nice representation of it. Hopefully, so you've heard what Liz said, and some of that makes sense as well for those people who've been through it yourselves. So second bit, if you have you picked up any extra tips from today? Again, yes, no, or somewhat. There you go, Liz. Nice bit of validation for your session today. Excellent. So one of the things we always say with these sessions, they're always recorded, and we'll share the link with you afterwards. So you'll be able to share these with colleagues if any of your colleagues didn't get a chance, or you found this interesting and you wanted to share with them as well. So great, we've got some 100% feedback on that one. So last question was, if you haven't published before, or you have published before, what would you like to publish? Any thoughts on what it is that you've got? Any thought? I mean, Liz has already offered the offer of any support around that. Any thoughts around what you might like to publish in the future? As you enter those, they should pop up on the screen. This is where I trust the technology. Okay, yeah. Okay. Day 16, that's helpful. Day 16 program. There we go. Whoever wrote that, please make yourself known to Mark and Andy. I'm sure they will love to hear how you got on. Case studies, yeah. Experiential narrative, abstracts. Excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you very much for your participation. I appreciate it. So I'm going to hand back to Andy. I think he's going to run through, wrap up with a short plenary session at the end.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Liz. Absolutely fascinating session, Liz. Really, really interesting. So thank you ever so much for that. I don't think we've got any questions in the chat room as such, but what we want to do is just open it up to the wider audience, really. So if there are any questions people have, please feel free to kind of take a hands-up approach on Teams, and we'll take them from the top. Mark.
Yeah, I thanks, Liz. That was fantastic. I'd really be interested in what your 2014 article was that was continuously cited.
It's 2004, and it was actually timely discharge practice from hospital, and it was really it was used in policy. It was quoted. It was quoted in 2010 in some Welsh guidance. Then I found it being quoted and used heavily in Australia. And I think that the trick was I didn't know at the time. I won't claim that I knew because I didn't know. I was able to write something that stood the test of time. And it was principles rather than something that was going to change with the next government or change with the next fashionable thing to do. And I think people used it to validate their work, and I never expected it.
It strikes me that you need quite a lot of internal resilience for writing. I hadn't realised that, the amount of rejection you could potentially get, but it's in a positive way. But yeah.
But the rejection gets less and less, and I would think I'd failed abysmally today at the little guide I've given. If you were rejected, most people get rejected because they send a manuscript off, and usually because someone has said, "Oh, you should try and get this published," because they don't realise they should choose the journal first. They should choose their audience. So if you could bear in mind the top tips, you should at least get it on the desk of an editor who's interested in what you've got to say.
I think that's brilliant, and Nick's actually put that article into the chat room.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Liz. Callum, over to you, my friend.
Hi, Liz. Thank you very much for that. I suppose just thinking kind of as leading an A16 site myself and knowing who I'm working with, and I suppose they'd be really keen to write up some data and some text to go with the data to show some outcomes of what we've done over the last 6 months. Mm-hmm. So we might not write a 15-page article, but we might write an abstract about what we've done, the process, the participants, maybe a tool we've used. And I suppose it's really about relating what you just said, which was great, to how we can implement it with our trusts that we're working with currently.
Yeah, so I think if you're going to write an abstract, the trick is to write the rubbish, write anything down you can write down. And it's not going to be rubbish, but write it down very messily, just get it down, get everyone's contributions down. And then I would edit according to IMRAD, which stands for Introduction, Methods, Results, and the A, and Discussion. And IMRAD is generally the one that is used for the framework of abstracts. There are, of course, abstracts where it's all bunched together. But you'd be then taking a few words of, well, what did we do? What was the basis of what we do, the introduction? And then you get your results. But with an abstract, the thing to bear in mind is if you want to pop it in for conferences and things, look at your conference that you're thinking of putting it in for, or look at where it's got to go first. So whilst it's not a journal, I often put stuff up for the Society for Acute Medicine, unashamedly put things in for that. And they will allow you 150 words in some of their sections, which is really next to nothing. And in others, they'll allow you 300. So it's knowing, the bulk of an abstract should ideally be on one side of paper. It should never go over the other side of the paper. It should ideally be structured, and usually the same as I said with journals, structured for an audience. So remembering, if someone's diabetic, it's structured for a diabetic. So it's knowing who's going to want to read it.
Yeah, because I think it's going to be really important when we come towards the end of this in September to have a physical piece of work that would be really useful. As much as the data and the outcomes is fantastic, I think it'd be really good to showcase some of the work. And I'm sure some of the people on the call and who will watch the recording would be really interested to maybe get our support to help write something, and then obviously your specific talents to hone that even better.
It's called sticking pins in your eyes, Callum, but it's actually very enjoyable after a while. I'm very happy to help if it was a one-off meeting, and to be able to shape that up, I'd be very happy to help that, because I think I can cut through a lot of the pain that people go through, say, no, they won't want that. Yes, that's an important point. It's knowing what's important.
Brilliant, thank you.
Great, thanks, Callum. Thanks for the question and the points you made. So there's no more hands up. Last opportunity, we've got a few minutes left. Last opportunity to tap into Liz's vast experience and knowledge, really. So any further questions that people want to ask? If not, then I'll take that back to Mark for closing.
Thanks, Andy. So again, thank you, Liz. That's fantastic and really practical, and I think will be really helpful for our partners. We're going to be moving to our next shared learning event on the 21st of July, and that's going to be with our good friend and colleague Vincent Baxter, who's going to talk about the model for improvement. Myself and Andy are going to be taking a short break, so we're handing the controls over to Nick and Pete for that event. Yes, so thank you very much for taking time to spend with us today, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.